Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, where we explore all aspects of ending relationships, separation, and parenting apart. If your marriage or partnership has ended, or you have friends and family who are separating, this podcast is for you. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor, divorce specialist, and co-founder of Amicable, the online legal service for separating couples. In each episode, we look at relationships and separation from different angles, including the emotional, legal, and social. I'm joined by experts and special guests who share their own unique stories, experience, and tips, with the goal of helping people end relationships in a kinder and better way. In this episode, I'm joined by multi-award-winning financial coach and international author Catherine Morgan to discuss pensions and other financial aspects of divorce. We begin by discussing Catherine's own journey of becoming a financial coach and how personal life trauma has helped reshape her relationship with money. We go on to talk about financial trauma and how it may affect our thoughts and actions during a divorce. We move on to talking about pensions and why many people have such a strong emotional attachment to them. Catherine gives advice on how to avoid unfair pension arrangements during a divorce and what steps to take to rectify your financial situation post-divorce. Finally, Catherine shares her top tips on how to get on top of your finances through scheduling money dates with yourself and asking for help from experts or people who've been in a similar situation. If you loved this episode, then please subscribe and rate us on your preferred listening platform. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Kate. I always find it an interesting experience when somebody is reading out your bio. So,
yeah, it is, isn't it? It's read back to you. So I think, have I done all of
those
that?
things?
Well, it's amazing. It's lovely to have you with us. Thank you for joining me. We're going to talk a little bit today about pensions and divorce. But before we do, I'd like to just understand your personal journey from being a regulated financial advisor to becoming a well-being speaker, and how that transition, which is very inspiring, has kind of impacted what you do and how you think about money.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I feel like this is really going to resonate for a lot of your listeners today, because in the same way that the conversation around divorce can bring up a lot of emotions, my own experience with money has been a very emotional journey too, which on the surface seems quite unfamiliar sometimes when we think about money. You know, we think money is very practical, it's very tangible, but actually the relationship that we have with money is really just a mirror reflection of the relationship that we have with ourselves. And my own journey through that emotional lens was, I was a financial advisor from the age of 20. I moved into financial services when I was 18. And I was giving advice to a lot of women, predominantly actually in the village that I lived in Buckinghamshire in the UK. And I was giving clients advice on things like inheritance tax and pension planning and investing. And in the meanwhile, whilst I was doing this, I was living in £30,000 worth of debt. And so you can imagine the shame that I experienced, shame being one of the biggest money emotions that I experienced, having known, taken all of the qualifications, and I was a pension transfer specialist, and I wasn't doing those things for myself because I didn't feel worthy of having money because of what money meant to me. Money to me growing up was very much for men. It was associated with greed, and it was associated with manipulation and financial abuse. And so, of course, when I was earning money, I didn't want to keep hold of it because I didn't want to be considered to be greedy or manipulative or malicious or any of those associations that I had created with money. And I didn't realize this on a conscious level, by the way. So I didn't go to my job and kind of think, oh, this is what money means to me, and this is why I spend it as quickly as I earn it. But what I actually realized is when I almost lost my son at 5 weeks old, I was in hospital with him. He was very, very poorly, and I took him down to A&E when he was 5 weeks old, and he was in hospital for a couple of weeks with meningitis, and we almost lost him. And it was during that experience that I realized that the way that I reacted and responded to situations that were out of my control, and the way I reacted to situations that disrupted my nervous system, that made me feel unworthy of certain aspects of myself, that I would try and control those scenarios by overspending. And that was the pattern for me. That was the pattern of safety, is that I would accumulate money, spend money, accumulate money, spend money, because that felt safe for me. And it wasn't until I joined the dots and connected that whole piece that I then realized why I was behaving the way that I was with money. And so I decided that I needed to go teach other people what I had learned, because I then completely changed my entire financial situation.
That's a fascinating story, isn't it? I mean, the whole essence of that is that some life event made you realize the relationship you had with money and how that relationship was impacting on other life events and other aspects of your life. It's incredible when you look at it. And when I hear you say that, it sounds so obvious, but up until you just said it, I'd never thought of it like that. And actually thinking about it, as we're talking about a divorce or separation scenario, your relationship with money has a huge impact in how you go into trying to sort that out, whether it's negotiating or whatever it is with your partner or with the help of somebody else. It must have a massive impact on how you actually come to an agreement and what that agreement looks like. Before you've even sort of sat down at a table, you're bringing so many ideas and so much baggage with you, aren't you, by the sounds of it?
Completely. And what I find super interesting about this is that even if you have been in this relationship for many, many years, the fact is that you're both coming into that relationship as two separate people. And as individuals, you will have individual needs, you will have individual value systems, you have individual relationships with money that have been formed, sometimes even before you were born. You know, the evidence and the research shows that actually there's a direct link to how our parents, grandparents, and 3 generations and how they behave with money actually go on to imprint how we behave with money. And so if you just think about that in the context of conversations with money, you're both coming to those conversations with completely different emotions, different experiences, different belief systems around money.
Well, you've got a whole army of people behind you, haven't you? Because so many times these days, parents are, they're not physically in the room, but they are in the room with us when we're talking about divorce settlements and money anyway, because there's often loans to children or even loans to parents, or there's the promise of sorting things out financially post-divorce. There are gifts that parents are very keen to ring fence, and, a couple is trying to negotiate, trying to think about what their family is going to think about the various debts and other things, and the family aren't represented. So it becomes incredibly complex, and all of that is unseen. It's like the iceberg analogy, isn't it? All of that's below the surface. And what you're seeing on the surface is 2 people and a spreadsheet, which might look quite rational, but you've got all of the emotion coming underneath it as well. When you were going through your particular journey and that sort of revelation after your son had been so poorly, did you have help to kind of come to those conclusions, or were you able to join those dots yourself?
Yeah, a combination of a few things, actually. So I started exploring a lot of books. I did a lot of qualifications, psychology, neurolinguistic programming, mindset work. But I also had therapy. I had a coach. And so it wasn't a fast and quick journey for me. And a lot of it was linked to traumas that I had experienced in my past. And all of us have money traumas. Like when people hear the word trauma, we sometimes just associate that with, with war, with soldiers, or with big T things, big traumas. And actually, we all have money traumas, even if it was something very small that your mom or your dad or your grandparent or a kid at school said to you about money. Sometimes that can create a belief system in our mind where we then make future decisions based on those perceptions. And that's the key, is that all of this work is based on perceptions. Most of how we experience or believe around money isn't actually true. It's all a perception. And for most of us, even just the concept of divorce is we have these perceptions of what that should look like, as well as judgment from other people, as well as societal impacts. I'm sure we can go into some of these things as well on the show today. All of these perceptions that we have about how things should be put a lot of pressure on the partnership, the 2 people involved in that divorce settlement. So I do think that actually understanding the narratives or the perceptions or the stories that you attach to money directly can be super valuable in the context of divorce settlement conversations.
Yeah. And I want to just ask about the sort of ideas around trauma then. So, what would constitute a money trauma for people who haven't come across this before? So, in your younger life, what sorts of things actually then have the impact later on?
Yeah. So, well, let me just first of all, explain what money trauma is, and then I'll give you a personal experience for me actually involving divorce when I was a kid. So, trauma, the word trauma is just a disruption to our nervous system. So, it's something that doesn't feel safe. And it can really significantly impact how people handle financial decisions during separation and divorce. So often in my work, I see somebody who may appear to be making financially unfavorable decisions during a divorce. Maybe they've given up their pension rights in favor of keeping the house, which on the surface, this might look like poor financial planning. But when we dig deeper, it's often because their nervous system is just seeking safety and security, which feels familiar. And often a house does provide that, for many people. But it can also show up, if you look in the context of trauma, there's 4 main trauma responses that we see with money. The first one is a fight response. So this is when we can become maybe a little bit obsessive about the detail around finances, maybe, looking at every single penny, every single pound and how that's allocated, having all the spreadsheets completed. That's can be a fight response. We also see that in the second form, which is a flight response. And a flight response is when we can just avoid making any decisions altogether, like just bury our heads in the sand, probably don't even reach out for support, just do whatever's the easiest thing to do, right? That's a flight response. A freeze response, a freeze trauma response, is when we can become so unable to make any decisions. So quite similar to flight, but rather than running away, your nervous system just goes into pause. And so maybe nothing gets done. Maybe the letters go unopened that come through the post. Maybe we just don't reply to the emails from the lawyers, or, it's that kind of response. And then the final one, which is the one I see most prevalent in women specifically, is the fawning response. And some of you may not have heard of fawning in the context of trauma. And fawning is like the people pleaser, it's the overgiver. And so for many women, we see this where they are quite agreeable to unfavorable financial settlements just to keep the peace that actually don't serve them. And we know already that women's wealth pots are 35% lower than men's, right? Because of all the reasons we can talk about. So those are some of the typical kind of behaviors that you would see if we were experiencing a trauma response to money conversations around divorce. Now, how this showed up for me as an example of this is when I was growing up, my parents did divorce when I was very young, and money was used as a way to kind of manipulate the other person. Money was used as if you want to see your kids, you've got to pay me more money type conversation, right? And so as a child, my belief system and my nervous system just went into flight freeze, that anytime money is talked about in a relationship, it's always done in a way that is very controlling. And so I guess that's why in later life that did impact the way that I then made decisions around money. And I think for a lot of kids, if you can have an amicable divorce, then better for you and better for the kids, because this can have a long-term impact on children and how they then go on to behave with money too.
It's so interesting, the use of the word amicable in that statement following the conversation about fawning, because as you were talking about fawning, I was thinking to myself, oh yeah, sometimes people think being amicable is about just giving in for the sake of being amicable and not rocking the boat. But when we use the word amicable and when we're helping people in our context, it's not about that. We often say that sometimes amicable can be the aspiration, but you have to have a lot of hard conversations to get there. And it doesn't mean just glossing over things or people pleasing or nodding along or agreeing with something that fundamentally isn't going to meet the needs that both of you have. So it was just really registering in my head as you were saying those two things. Super fascinating, this idea of fawning. We see it a lot. a huge amount. And you're right. I think there's something about the society perception of women and not wanting to be seen as aggressive, or I suppose we've had to live through decades of terrible headlines in the papers about gold digging and about men giving away their finances to women, as opposed to the perception, the real life perception of this is a shared pot and we're dividing it up. No one's giving anybody anything else. So I think that plays into this whole money trauma. I think as a sex, we are slightly traumatized by the social environment in which we've grown up in, the whole money conversation around women. And it feels like we're really at a shifting point now.
Yeah. And it's interesting to even just the word like personal pension. If you think about, and you break that down, it's like it's a personal possession when you just talked there about it being in, what is the joint pot of money, the joint pot of assets. And actually, I think there's a lot to be said about that, because a lot of us can, and particularly men, because men do tend to be the main pension holders, that holding more significant wealth because, they don't necessarily have periods out of work and all of those things. But there is a very strong identity connection with pensions because of the status connection. Men can be very emotionally attached to their pensions. So a lot of their sense of self-worth and identity is tied to their role as a financial provider. And so a personal pension kind of represents their ability to continue to provide. And so I just think even just breaking down the semantics, the wording or the language that we use around
the
pensions.
Language of it, yeah. Yeah. Well, we are talking about pensions today. So let's put a focus then on the whole idea of pensions. And you're right. It's just even the name personal pension is deeply unhelpful when it comes to helping people divorce and separate and separate pensions in particular. Why then, name aside, let's just unpack that a little bit further. Why do you think people see pensions as personal assets when, from a law perspective, a legal perspective, a marital asset can be, it doesn't matter whose name it's in, it doesn't matter if a house is in a single person's name. The house doesn't seem to have the same personal attachment to somebody, even if it is in just one person's name, as say a pension does. What's behind this? Where has this come from, do you think?
I think a lot of it is just the genuine emotional attachment. And if you take a scenario of, husband and wife, husband has been the main breadwinner, he's provided financially for the family, then his view is that pension is representative of his individual contribution to the house. And we're not even going into the reasons why this couple may be divorcing, but if there's any guilt attached to that scenario, maybe there's affairs involved, or there could be multiple reasons, right? I'm not making any judgments here, but just as an example, is that they can become very attached individually to that asset. And it can be hard for people to let them go, and I think because pensions are very symbolic of your life's work and your career success. And so if you think about the historical context of pensions, where traditionally men were the primary pension holders, many of those men would have watched their own fathers rely on their pensions for retirement, alongside this kind of cultural messaging that's reinforced that pensions are a masculine dominant power dynamic, and that pensions can create a sense of financial power or control in relationships. So, some men will view their pension as their money rather than shared wealth. And this can be particularly evident during divorce negotiations. So I don't think this isn't a male-female conversation, but I think historically and traditionally the context is important. Yeah.
You mentioned the word contribution just then as well, and that just sort of triggered something in my mind. When it comes to divorce, we have what's called the law of equal contribution in this country. And that basically means, for anyone who's listening who's not familiar, it means that it doesn't matter whether you've stayed at home to raise children or whether you've been the person who's worked external to the home and been remunerated for it in cash terms. The contribution is deemed to be equal between you. So there's no legal sort of division between what people contribute in a marriage. And that's where this idea of a sharing principle comes from, that whatever your contribution is deemed to be equal, because the court doesn't have the will or the ability to be able to do anything other than say there's an equal contribution. Imagine trying to work out whose put in most, it would just be an absolute minefield. So we have this sentiment of equal contribution. And it means that things are, as a starting point, shared 50-50. But it doesn't always work out that way. There are lots of reasons to depart from 50-50. Because I think one of the other traps is people just decide they're going to split everything in half and off they go. And that's fair. But we know, particularly with pensions, just splitting a pension in half based on the CETV can be deeply unfair. Can you tell us a little bit about why just splitting pensions in that way can be very catastrophic?
I think that when you look at it in that context, the pension is deemed as, one of the significant assets in that financial contribution. And that isn't always the case. And I think just thinking about the financial contribution and the emotional contribution are two completely different things. And so sometimes the other person can feel quite devalued, if maybe they didn't contribute as much financially into that pension pot. I think there is a big danger of devaluing, that in the context of when it isn't represented through money and it isn't represented through financials. But also we do know that it is still a really important part of the conversation to be had, because women do have less wealth in their pots than men. And so it is important that these conversations happen so that we can then decide, in that conversation, what is the best outcome for the two of you. And it isn't just about the two of you, it's also about children and their future generations as well, because as I heard in a really great example at a conference that I know, Kate, you were speaking at, that I was hosting earlier this year. There was an example of a guy who gave, his father actually was in the civil service, and his mum and dad divorced, and his mum was just like, it's fine, you keep the pension, I'll keep the house. It was very amicable. They were like, that's cool, that's fine. But then he died less than, I think it was like 2 or 3 years later. And his whole pension died with him because there was no spouse to pay it on to. It couldn't pay on to dependents because his children were older than 21. And so that whole wealth pot generationally was lost. So had they have had a conversation around, well, maybe we should try and protect some of this wealth for future generations, then that would have been super helpful then when his mum then went into a care home, and she could have done with that money to pay for private care. So, yeah, I do think it is super important in the context of these conversations.
It's interesting because when people divorce, and so a married couple that divorces, they can have a consent order that sets out the agreements they've come to on their property and money. And in that consent order, you can have a pension sharing order, which says what's going to happen to pensions. That's not the case if you don't have a consent order. So if you just get divorced and don't have the financial agreement that goes alongside a divorce in most cases, or if you're an unmarried cohabiting couple, you don't have the same pension rights, do you? So there are huge numbers of people, and we know the numbers are absolutely huge. There's a study out called Fair Shares by the University of Bristol and the Nuffield Foundation, and they showed that the majority of people don't do anything on pensions. Everybody keeps their own and off they go. And this is creating a huge amount of pressure financially on women later in life. And it's like a real precipice, dropping off a cliff moment when you transition from working and being able to cope to actually then not working and realizing you don't have a pension. You might be sitting in a house that maybe you can't sell or you can't release the equity from. Or even when you do release the equity from, you're only downsizing a little bit, and therefore you just don't have enough cash to buy the annuity. It hasn't had enough time to sort of mature or anything. And therefore you are really stuck sometimes, aren't you? If you are one of these people, whether it's because you're not married, whether it's because you haven't sorted out the pension and hadn't had an order for that, then you are in a bit of a bind, aren't you? If you're sitting in that scenario now, what do you think your advice to people would be? What can they do to try and rectify if that ship has sailed? What are the options at this point? So if you've had a divorce and you haven't had a consent order, one of the options is to go back to your ex and try and get one in place. if that ship has sailed and it's too far past the point where that's a reasonable option for you, then I guess it's what can you do to provide a pension for yourself if you are post-divorce at this point in your life?
Yeah, great question. And I think just going back to what you were mentioning as well about when you're cohabiting, that there is no automatic right to a share of your partner's pension. I remember as a client of mine, actually around 7 or 8 years ago, her husband died very suddenly in a car accident and she was left with 5 children and they were not married. And so she literally got nothing. The property was in his name only. His pension obviously was in his name and they weren't married. So at the time, she was left in a pickle because they hadn't prepared or planned for the worst case scenarios. And I think when it comes to looking back, one of the things I'm a big believer in is there is a lot of merit to be had in reflecting back and considering the decisions that you have made before. But also that can bring up a lot of guilt and a lot of shame around, I should have done this, or, if only I'd known this information, if only I'd listened to this podcast like 5 years ago, then I would have made a different decision. And I think it's really important to not fall into that trap of self-shaming and sitting in that place of guilt, because this is why these conversations are so important, is that we're not taught about this. I think that I don't know whether you do it as part of your wedding ceremony, probably not. But I think that every person should be like sent an information pack or something that tells them what they should do and things that they should consider and conversations that they should have. And I feel very fortunate that I had this information because I was in financial services, but I also appreciate that we weren't taught this. So I think that's the first thing, is just to acknowledge, like, don't sit in a place of
And you try
shaming.
telling someone who's getting engaged or about to get married that this is the sort of stuff they should be doing. I've done it a couple of times recently because obviously I'm not the sort of person not to say it. But I can tell you I am deeply unpopular. It's just not a conversation people are willing to have or want to have. But you're right. We often say in the intro to this podcast, if you're going through this or you know somebody who is, this is the podcast for you. I feel like I need to change that to you should just listen to this. If you're happily married or you're contemplating getting married, you should listen to the divorce podcast before you marry, because this is where you'll find out all the stuff you need to have in order to get your ducks in a row and to make sure you've got a nice planned exit if the worst comes to the worst.
Yeah, and that's it, isn't it? And there's many of us that will like to plan ahead. But there's also a lot of us that live in the moment and we're very impulsive and we don't think about the worst case scenarios. Who likes to think about the worst case scenarios, right? So I think that's the first thing, is just to acknowledge that if you're listening to this and you are in that situation where it's happened, there's nothing you can really do about it. But going forwards, it's never too late to get started investing. It's never too late to get started investing in pensions or any other investment vehicle. It doesn't have to be a pension. A pension is just a pot where you can put some money and you get some lovely tax benefits attached to it. And it makes a lot of sense for most people, right? But even just investing, whether that is investing in building a business or in property or, in other types of investment assets, it doesn't really matter, but it's never too late to get started. And even in our community, the average age of the women in our community is 50 to 55, right? Most of the women that we serve have been through divorce, or they've been through a significant loss, or they've had an inheritance and then they've spent it all and they're coming to us because they feel a lot of shame around, how did I spend all this money? I'm terrible with money, all these things. And it's never too late. The fact that we are living longer, health is advancing, all of those things, it's never, ever too late. So if you're in that situation, my advice would be to go and read books, listen to podcasts, have conversations with other like-minded people to explore what are the possibilities looking forward, as opposed to looking back and filling yourself with all the negative, low in energetic emotions of guilt and shame, because we've all been there. We've all been in situations where we wish we could go and turn back the clock and do things differently.
Yeah, I feel like that every time I have to do my tax return. It's kind of like, and then I'm sending stuff to my accountant and I feel really embarrassed and I'm thinking, why am I feeling like this? So I think it's important, isn't it? I think what we're saying is it's normal to feel like a bit iffy about money and what you have and haven't got and what you have and haven't spent and what you have and haven't done. And just to try somehow just to get over ourselves and embrace that a little bit, and to feel that the advisors we're going to, I chose a woman advisor specifically for this point because I knew that I couldn't sit there with a man without being a bit pathetic about it. Oh, no, that's my bad. But I think you have to be able to have that relationship with the people that are helping and coaching and advising you, don't you? And I think if you can put a little bit of time into picking a relationship, I think some of the rest will then follow. So I always think just break it down one step at a time. The first thing I have to do is find somebody that I feel I can have an open conversation with. If I've done that, that's a massive tick in the box. And then I can start to think about the sorts of advice, and I can air my dirty money laundry in public, can't I? And I can start to do that bit and get myself together and then take up the advice bit by bit. And I guess for a lot of women, particularly when it's been a divorce, it might be the first time they're dealing with the amount of money or with the size of the decisions or the fact that they have to do all of the decisions for themselves from now on. It's not even that you can share those decisions out. That can be quite a big step for people to take, can't it? That first thing where you might have shared a pension. It might be the first time you've had to invest your pension on your own and that kind of stuff. And that can feel quite overwhelming.
Absolutely. And one of the things I would suggest is have a money date with yourself. So I do this every Friday. I have a Finance Friday. It's in my calendar. I have an hour a week and I just pick one area of my finances. And I think, right, what are the micro steps or the micro wins that I could create in this area? So let's say maybe it is pensions and you're thinking, oh, I think I have an old pension somewhere. Go and use the government tracing service. Go and speak to PensionWise. Go and reach out to a financial coach and get their support in understanding what you already have. And then your second micro step might be to have a look at the funds that you're invested in, get interested in, are they invested ethically? Are they in sustainable funds? Are they in companies that you support? The third micro step might be to check your beneficiary options are all up to date, that you've got that nominated to who you want it to go to. Your fourth micro step might be to have a look at the charges on that pension to see if you could switch to another pension provider, because we know the impact of investment charges long-term on pensions. So you kind of break down one big goal of pensions to, oh, okay, well, this week I'm just going to actually go and find out how much income would I get from my personal pension. Go and get a state pension forecast on the Government Gateway website. Go and understand what your state pension forecast is. Then look at your personal pensions and then create those micro steps and just do it bit by bit each week. And don't feel embarrassed to ask for help because no one teaches us about this. So you're not alone in this.
It's not taught anywhere, is it? It's just not taught anywhere. I think that's such an interesting point. I mean, the number of people when we're helping and dealing with pensions, the first question we always get asked is, can you help me understand this bit of paper that X pension company has sent me? Because there's so many different figures on the pieces of paper and not understanding what that means. And sometimes people get confused between the lump sum and whether that's what they're going to get once or whether they can draw it down more than once, and what the actual amount of money they're going to get per month is and for how long. And so it's all of those. Sometimes just for me, the first step is getting that piece of paper out and trying to actually work out what it's telling me. How much am I going to get? For how long? Will I have to pay any tax on that? So what am I going to be living on? Is it index linked? So will it go up, or is it just a finite pot? I think some of those very basic, can you please help me with this pension statement? They're the sort of some of the real basic stuff that lots of us just need some help with, aren't
and
they?
a lot of us don't even know how we're living right now. Like we have a little pension course. It's like £49. You can grab it on our website, catherinemorgan.com. It's a little course. And one of those things is to understand what your current lifestyle is so that when you think about retirement, you can start to go through each of your spending pots and go, well, is that going to stay the same, stop or continue in retirement? Is that going to go up? Is it going to go down? Then you can look at that and go, okay, cool. So my current expenses are 20 grand a year, 30 grand a year, whatever that may be. Actually, in retirement, it's going to be less because I'm not paying a mortgage, but I'm going to have loads of more free time and I want to travel the world, or I want to have a couple of extra holidays a year, So actually just starting from that perspective might be a really good exercise to do as a money date. But also there's some really cool, funky ways that you can better understand your pension statements through using AI. So dare I mention the AI conversation on this podcast, right? But I have created my own investment manager using AI. So I can go into my AI, I can share my pension statements and I can say, help me to understand what options this gives me at retirement. Tell me about the funds I've invested in, how they've been performing. How would you reallocate this in terms of my investment risk allocation? Like there's so many ways now using AI as an example that we can make that information much more accessible to understand.
That's definitely part 2 of the guide to getting divorced and sorting out your
using
pension.
AI.
I think using your own AI.
Yeah, and it's not wholly reliable. So, having someone by your side through that process is always going to be the best way. But, if it's getting to understand investment markets or pensions, that there's plenty of resources around and plenty of support available to you.
We've talked a little bit about some of the mistakes people make when thinking about pensions and divorce. Do you think we've missed anything? What about the impact of friends and family and some of the narratives that they might feed to people? How does that shape up when it comes to divorce and pensions?
Yeah, I think, friendships is a really interesting one because very often, especially in a separation or divorce, there's going to be shared friendship groups, and that can be challenging, right? Is that for the friend, who do you side with and who do you decide to carry on that friendship with? And so everyone will always have an opinion. Everyone's always going to have their own experiences to throw in, oh, don't let that happen to you like it happened to me, And so friends or family can often provide very useful support, but also they may not have the financial understanding about what is specific to your financial situation. And so if you're going to work with an expert to support you in this, then they're always going to be able to do it in a way that doesn't involve the emotion. And if we can make money decisions and remove the emotion out of the equation, which is not 100% possible to remove them completely, but when somebody as a third party is involved that doesn't know you, doesn't have a shared friendship group with you, isn't emotionally connected to help to support you, which is what a friend or family member would do, then, you will get a different outcome. So I think listen to those opinions as you will anyway, but just be careful not to make decisions based on those opinions, because sometimes they may be valid, sometimes they may not be valid. And so we shouldn't ignore the micro steps that are available to us if we've got that option available.
It's interesting, isn't it? I do think that friends and family have their own sort of take on pensions. And do you think there's a generational difference in how people think about pensions as well, which sometimes has an impact? And I guess the point at which you divorce, we probably should have said this at the beginning, the point at which you divorce will often dictate the kind of amount of time and energy people put into looking into pensions. If you're divorcing in your 20s or 30s and pension pots are small and neither of you've taken time out of the workplace, then I guess it's not the end of the world to everybody keep their own pensions in that scenario. But as you get on into longer marriages where you've had children and breaks from the workplace, that's when it becomes more complex and warrants more thought and time. Just as a sort of roundup, what would be your top tips if there are people listening who are going through a divorce and are thinking about pensions as part of their divorce? What are the pitfalls to avoid, and what are the top tips in terms of making sure you've uncovered or understand what's on the table?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say, my biggest tip would just be to just allocate some energy and headspace and time to this aspect of your financial planning. Your future self will definitely thank you for it. And whilst it may seem like an insignificant thing to get your head around at the time, it is something that is the one thing that will make the biggest difference for that gender wealth disparity that we are currently experiencing. And this isn't just for you, this is for every single generation ahead of us. And I think the more of us that can allocate some capacity, even if that is someone walking it through with you step by step, I get really passionate and quite emotional about this subject because I've seen the impact for women and for men when these conversations have not happened. And so I hope that from listening to not just this episode, but other of your episodes, Kate, that the biggest tip I would say is just ask for help. Like asking for help, get help from people who know what they're talking about. They've been through very similar examples. They've supported other people through this journey. So they will know, they'll know everything. They'll know what happens when somebody tries to hide one of their assets. They'll know all of those scenarios. And so very often my experience is women tend to not get help when they are perhaps have been in a narcissistic relationship. And there's a lot of manipulation and control involved, which makes them feel they just want to get it done quickly and they want to get it over and done with. And whilst I totally appreciate that might be how you have felt, it's also important that you give yourself some self-care. And part of self-care is making sure that you get access to something that is legally, you are
entitled to
it. Absolutely. And I think it is time we make a bit of a stand for those scenarios where we are felt like we should just do the easy route or get it done quickly. It's really important. It does have a big long-term impact on your financial situation in the future, your children's financial future in the distant future. So that would be my biggest tip, is just open up the conversation, even if nothing else, even if you decide at the end, you know what, this is just not what I want, that's fine, but just have the conversation.
Know that you've had it, absolutely, because you don't want to regret 4 or 5 years down the line, do you, that you didn't raise it? And I get that people, because we've talked about the psychology of money, to me as well, it's about the psychology of conflict, isn't it? So often our own responses to conflict and how prepared we are to be direct with somebody or to call something out, if we're not that type of personality, that impacts how we go into negotiations, how all of these things unfold. So you've got the psychology of conflict, the psychology of money playing into these negotiations. But if you don't raise it, you'll never know. And living with that regret, I think, is harder. And yeah, you've got the right to withdraw from a negotiation at any point. So just because you raise it, you don't have to conclude it. But I think at least if you know that it's important, it's at very least, it gives you some more leverage to negotiate on other things as well, doesn't it? So it's a conversation that we have to start having, and we have to change the narrative. This is not about taking something that isn't ours. It's not about being money grabbing. It's about having a sensible conversation about both of our futures, and we are both entitled to a future that's equal and equally comfortable. There shouldn't be a person in poverty simply because of the way the assets have been divided and chosen.
Absolutely. And even just in hearing you share that, Kate, saying things like, I don't want to be considered to be a money grabber, for example, maybe just take some time to reflect on, why is it that I am experiencing this feeling? It's often in the body. We can often feel it like it's an anxiety in the chest or in the pit of our stomach. It's a physical feeling. Asking yourself that question, why is it that I am reacting in this way around money? What did I learn about money growing up? What was taught to me around money and pensions growing up? And there may be some previous experiences where your parents went through a divorce and it wasn't nice and it was, unamicable. And so that may be driving the way that you're behaving. So just reflect on that question. What is my perception about money? Because that can really unlock a lot as well that will be super helpful to support you going forward with money.
And on that note, we will have to leave it. It's been fascinating chatting to you. Thank you so much, Catherine. I really enjoyed talking about it today. Where can people find out more about you and the services that you offer?
Thank you so much. I've really loved this conversation. Well, as a podcast listener, come over and listen to my show. It's called It's Not About the Money. Or if you head to my website, catherinemorgan.com, we also gift a free copy of my paperback book to anybody who comes to the website. So you can just grab a copy of that. And that will really help you to dive into some of the money stories that maybe you're holding on to, so that we can help you to feel safe with money.
That's brilliant. And anyone who's contemplating divorcing and maybe wanting to use the amicable service, I can highly recommend going to Catherine first, so you come well prepared. I'm on LinkedIn, and you can hear about new podcast episodes by subscribing for updates or visiting thedivorcepodcast.com on your favourite listening platform. Thank you very much indeed, Catherine, for your time today. And thank you, everybody, for listening.